Welcome everyone to this Policy and Practice seminar hosted by the UCL Department of Political Science and the UCL Centre on U.S. Politics. The title of tonight's event, Trump Episode 2, The Imperial Presidents Strikes Back. My name's Thomas Gift. I'm an associate professor and the director of the Center on U.S. Politics, and I'll be your chair for this evening. This evening we're going to be talking about the limits and reaches of presidential power. With Donald Trump back in the White House, there's certainly never been a more urgent time to examine how checks and balances on the executives work or don't work. Are Congress, the courts, and the bureaucracy strong enough to constrain an imperial presidency, or will they ultimately enable it? To guide us on this topic, we're very, very fortunate to be joined by three experts, one in the room, who I'll introduce in the order in which they'll deliver their opening remarks. First off is Andy Rudalevige here in person. He is the Thomas Brackett Reed Professor of Government at Bowdoin College in the US, and we're very fortunate to have him as an honorary professor at the UCL Centre on US Politics. Second, joining us remotely is Rachel Potter, who is Associate Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia and also a Senior Fellow at the Miller Center for Public Affairs. Her research focuses on American political institutions with an emphasis on the executive branch and the bureaucracy. And then last but not least, Molly Reynolds is Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution. She studies Congress with an emphasis on how congressional rules and procedure affect domestic policy outcomes. Just very briefly, in terms of the event format, each speaker is going to have about 5 to 7 minutes to deliver opening remarks. Then we'll have a panel discussion, and finally we'll open the floor to all of your questions. Just a few details. The whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will be posted online on the department's website, our YouTube channel, and our podcast after the evening. If you speak, you will be heard in the recording. We'll let you know when the recording is available, and we hope you might share it with others. So with that, I will hand it over to Andy.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. I could spend 7 minutes thanking everybody, so I will forego that, but I am very grateful to have the chance to be back in London and with such excellent guests who have vanished for the moment, but will be back shortly. I'm going to take my time and very, very quickly run you through sort of a history of the presidency, actually, with a little bit of a focus at the end on how the current administration is threatening to push past the limits that have been imposed on that office over time. Okay, so here's the text for the evening. H.L. Mencken, the American humorist, once said that no man, no person, would want to be president of the United States in strict accordance with the Constitution. So there's good reason for that. After all, if we look to the Federalist Papers, to Alexander Hamilton discussing the powers of the office in the Constitution, right? He comes down and argues that, in fact, the governor of New York might have more power than the president. Certainly, the King of England, which had been the accusatory claim of anti-federalists, those who opposed the Constitution, they had said the president would be a, quote, the fetus of monarchy, only waiting for the chance to grow up. Hamilton said no. After all, the president did execute the laws, but he had to faithfully execute the laws, and Congress had to pass them first. Plus, they had the power of the purse. He could veto legislation, but Congress could override that veto if they felt strongly. He could negotiate treaties, but of course that required the sign-off of a 2/3 Senate majority. He made a lot of appointments across the executive branch and the judiciary as well, but that too required Senate sign-off. President's commander-in-chief, but Congress has a lot of authority over foreign policy in the Constitution, the power to declare war, of course, but also explicit power over immigration and trade policy. And if there are inherent executive powers hidden somewhere, perhaps in the vesting clause, the executive power is vested in a president, well, Congress, again, has the upper hand. They can impeach and remove the president from office. Congress can fire the president. The president cannot fire Congress. So, if that's so, why do so many people actually want to be president? And the short answer comes from Edward Corwin. historian, political scientist of the mid-20th century. The history of the presidency, he said, has been a history of aggrandizement, starting really with George Washington, our first president, and we can, tick off the historical highlights: Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's little-known career as vampire hunter. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, Franklin Roosevelt. And so as Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes put it in a slightly different context, the history of the presidency in important ways comes down to the interbranch contestation of power over the course of American history. And a page of history, Justice Holmes said, is worth a volume of logic. Well, by the time we got to the 1970s, political scientists, historians, who had been really cheerleaders for a powerful presidency over time, including Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who had written very laudatory biographies of Andrew Jackson and FDR and John F. Kennedy, of course, he sort of turned on the office and on the ways that President Johnson and, of course, President Nixon had used it. We were now in the era, he said, of the Imperial Presidency, an era marked by the Vietnam War and, of course, by the Watergate scandal. Congress reacts to this in the 1970s. There's what in another place I've called the resurgence regime, this set of interlocking laws where Congress sort of deals itself back into the game. It had been ignored in areas of national security. It had been overridden on budgetary matters. The president had violated people's privacy and civil liberties, surveillance and the like. Numerous ethical violations, of course, associated with Watergate. Needed to figure out how you could prosecute executive corruption. All of these things are laws passed by Congress in this era, about 1973 to 1980. By 1981, one scholar said that the imperial presidency has been and gone. But he was wrong. In each of those areas, over the next number of years, the presidency effectively reasserted itself, helped somewhat by Congress refusing to enforce the laws itself had written. And of course, after the war on terror started, George W. Bush became the sort of poster child for a new imperial presidency, using the commander-in-chief power as a way to override congressional and even judicial checks and balances. But up till that time, we still hadn't had a president use their social media platforms to literally declare themselves to be a king. Now, I wish I could tell you this was a satirical magazine or a joke or The Onion, if you've read that. Right? No, these are actual tweets and social media posts from White House sources. On the left, from the Deputy White House Chief of Staff. On the right, as you can see, from the actual official White House social media accounts. The president, as you can see, taking credit for being the king. Long live the king. Now, small side note, President Trump has issued executive orders calling for patriotic education, which would seem to indicate that you should perhaps read your Constitution and maybe your Declaration of Independence, which comes in the same volume in many cases. It even comes in the Trump Bible. And yet, you'll note that that declaration is mostly about how bad it is to have a king. And if you were somebody of my age and grew up in the United States, Donald Trump is older than me, let me assure you, but he too perhaps watched a series called Schoolhouse Rock on Saturday mornings. One of the cartoons was called No More Kings. This is a fundamentally un-American claim, in short, and it sits badly. So in that sense, the actions of President Trump do go beyond the earlier work that I and many other scholars have done on the imperial presidency and executive authority generally. But I just want to sort of lay out and tee up Professor Potter and Dr. Reynolds in talking about different aspects of how this administration has moved forward and both built on prior precedent but also pushed past it in the areas of war powers, spending powers, administrative authority, again, some of it delegated by Congress over time, and ethics and civil liberties. So just really quickly, and again, we can come back to any of these questions either in the panel part of our talk or in your questions. But in war and emergency powers, for example, we've seen broad claims, not just from President Trump, of presidents saying that they don't have to follow the War Powers Resolution passed in the 1970s because anything short of a Vietnam-style war, that size of conflict, does not count as a war or as hostilities under the War Powers Resolution. And that's at the root of the president's ability, really, to order strikes, for example, in Yemen only last week and ongoing, I think. There have been delegated emergency powers given to the president over time. In 1976, the National Emergencies Act was passed. That was actually supposed to rein in presidential emergency authority. In the end, it has effectively enabled it for some complicated reasons. But the president and his predecessors, too, have been able to declare emergencies that can then unlock authority granted elsewhere in statute. With President Trump, we've seen the invocation, I would go so far as to say the invention of an invasion on the southern border. Immigration effectively redefined as invasion, and of course, more recently still, the specific invocation of a 1798 law, the Alien Enemies Act, which says that if you have been invaded, then you can kick out non-citizens from the invading country. He has decided that a Venezuelan gang is the invading army, presumably from Venezuela itself, but that's a little unclear. In any case, the administration is claiming quite loudly, both in public but also in court filings, that the judiciary has no authority to override or review even the president's decisions about foreign policy. When we look at executive action, of course, we've seen a chainsaw taken to a number of government departments and agencies. I think Rachel is going to talk more about that. But we've seen the extensive use of executive directives, executive orders, proclamations, presidential memoranda, and the like to reinterpret and in some cases, again, reinvent the law as it stands. This is not brand new. That is to say, lots of presidents have looked to existing authority. If you can't get Congress to pass a new law, maybe you can find a new meaning in an old law. But nonetheless, some of President Trump's efforts in this regard have gone, I think, quite a ways beyond what those laws authorize. The unitary executive, which I know will be discussed some more, suggests that the president has control over the entirety of the executive branch, even if the law says that you can't, for example, fire a member of a regulatory commission. Without good cause, President Trump is trying to push that point. He has fired several members of regulatory commissions without good cause. The cause is that they're Democrats. Franklin Roosevelt tried this in 1935, and the Supreme Court unanimously struck him down. We'll see if the Supreme Court has changed its mind on that point. But I would note that if this logic is taken to an extreme, and you can't buffer any part of the executive branch from the president, then the very legitimacy of the civil service is in question. With regards to the power of the purse, you've presumably heard a little bit about this, or a lot perhaps. A lot of agency spending has been cut back. Grants have been canceled. This goes by the name impoundment, the refusal of the president to spend appropriated funds, in some cases even those already obligated to recipients, some of them even spent already and then recalled literally from the bank account of those recipients. Shutting down agencies created in law, funded in law, and we've seen a number of efforts to defund political adversaries, who I'm from the state of Maine, and the governor of Maine is one of his disfavored adversaries at the moment. So Maine is going through some of this. And then when it comes to ethics and corruption, it's a long list here too. I would start with the president's failure to execute the law in several cases. On day one of his executive orders was not to follow the law banning TikTok. Other orders have followed that have told executive branch agencies not to enforce the law or regulations in some cases. Again, the president doesn't really have the power to do that. We've seen, of course, financial conflicts of interest, not least with Mr. Musk. There's lots of questions about data and Americans' personal data, which again, those 1970s laws were created to protect from politicization. We don't know the status of some of that. We've seen the use of the FBI and the Justice Department to threaten prosecution of certain individuals, again, people the president doesn't like or who tried to investigate him either in his first term or in the interregnum. And we've seen, of course, the wide use of pardon power. And again, not solely by President Trump. President Biden, on leaving office, pardoned a bunch of his family members. He pardoned a bunch of people preemptively who he thought might be targeted by the Trump administration. President Trump, in turn, pardoned all of the people, including those who were violent criminals, on January 6th, 2021. So here's an area that is hard to check under the Constitution, but troubling nonetheless. I would note all of this is backstopped by the Supreme Court's invocation of immunity for presidential acts in 2024, a big decision in the summer of 2024 that made it clear that you could not criminally prosecute a president for something he did in office as long as it was an official act, and in some cases on the edge of that. So just to wrap up, presidential power has been throughout American history, sort of a series of punctuated equilibria. It's mostly gone up over time, sometimes ratcheted back. One thing that's different now, I think, is the lack of an objective crisis, right? Civil War, right? Abraham Lincoln exercised a lot of authority, but the Civil War was a crisis. The Depression and World War II, even September 11th, right? Pretty clear causes for the claims that were made, even if you didn't agree with the extent of those claims or how the power was exercised. It's not clear to me what the problem is now. The Dow is too high, perhaps. The stock market is too good. Unemployment's too low. Tariffs are too tiny. I don't know. That's a little bit snarky, and it's meant to be. I think the broader crisis, at least as seen by President Trump and his supporters, has to do with the sort of aggregation of domestic culture wars. The changes that have occurred demographically in the US, right? Resentment of some parts of the population against immigration and against globalization, those who have lost in that development of the globalized economy want to win. And Donald Trump has been their retribution, as he promised in 2024. So just to leave you with this thought, which will tee up, I hope, Molly Reynolds, Justice Jackson, in a concurring opinion in 1952, they were ruling at that time on the seizure of private steel mills in the United States. It's called the Youngstown Steel case. And President Truman had issued an executive order saying that the United States would effectively nationalize those steel mills so that the workers couldn't go on strike and therefore jeopardize the war effort. The Korean War was going on. Justice Jackson joined the majority of the court in saying no, the president did not have that power. Invoking national security was not enough. And Jackson pointed out that Congress needed to act here. A crisis that challenges the president, he said, equally or perhaps primarily challenges Congress, but only Congress itself can prevent power from slipping through its fingers. This time it is The Onion, a satirical magazine, right? Trump claims to override the Constitution because of little-known "no one will stop me" loophole. And that will be the question, of course. Will he be stopped? So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andy. Next, I'll turn the mic over to Rachel Potter.
Thanks for having me to this conversation. I think it's a really important conversation to be having right now. So we're a little bit right at the 2-month mark, which kind of is hard to believe because so much has happened. And Andy asked me to talk about the Imperial Presidency in the context of what's happening in the bureaucracy and the administrative state more broadly. And so if we look at the kinds of things that are happening, they do 3 things. They reduce the size of government, they reduce the independence of federal agencies, and generally attack the power of the administrative state. So if you take a step back and just think about what Andy just said about an imperial president is one who tries to grow power, and the administrative state, the executive branch, reports to the president, it's not immediately obvious that a president would come to office and try to do all of these things. But I think if we put the imperial presidency together with the unitary executive theory, which Andy also mentioned, we get the sense that this is all about control. Donald Trump wants to control the administrative state and have it be under his direction, largely because he felt very thwarted by the deep state in Trump 1.0. And he's really trying to fix and correct that problem. So in trying to sort of catalog what's happened in the last 2 months, I have 3 buckets for myself in understanding changes to the administrative state. And they don't perfectly capture everything that's happened, but I think they do a pretty good job. So the first bucket is a Trump bucket. The second bucket is a Musk and Doge bucket. And the third bucket is what I call a conservative wish list, which is a combination of things that were concocted in Project 2025 or the America First Policy Institute or other conservative dominions that have long been thinking about how we could better set up government. So I'll talk briefly about each of these and what I think they mean. The Trump bucket has things that Trump cares about. These are things we've heard a lot about in terms of deportations, transgender youth and youth sports, the annexation of Greenland, and paper straws, if you're following that executive order as well. It's very clear to me as I think about these kinds of things that are very Trumpian, that Trump doesn't care about the administrative state of the bureaucracy and how it's run, right? He's unhappy about the deep state, but he's willing to let other people do his bidding, which takes me to bucket 2, the Musk and Doge bucket. So this is the bucket where we can think about things like the fork in the road email that all federal employees received, asking them if they'd like to voluntarily separate from government, the closing of the foreign aid agency, the USAID, the canceling contracts that Andy already mentioned, broad reductions in force. These are all things that Elon Musk, who is not an appointed, not a Senate confirmed, not even technically a government employee, in the official sense of the word, has taken on as his leadership role. This is a very haphazard approach to reforming government. I think pretty obviously when you take a chainsaw on stage and use that as your metaphor, that's not a considered and thoughtful way. It is an attack. It is very similar to what he did at Twitter or X when he took over. And I think if we think about what do these things mean, we're seeing already the courts are checking Musk in a lot of different ways, but the checking is very sporadic. It's not happening in sort of broad brush, everyone gets the same treatment. It'll happen to pockets of employees over there, or these kinds of grants and contracts. So there is going to be, I think, a longer, more durable effect just by virtue of people being intimidated, the cost of litigation, and just the uncertainty and unevenness of how policy is going to play out for Musk. So I don't think this is something that, the next president is easily going to rectify, because I think there is, even if the courts check Musk, some long-term damage that could manifest. Okay, and then the third bucket is the conservative dream wish list. So this has things on it like the elimination of the Department of Education, the return of what was called Schedule F in the first Trump administration. That is an executive order that Trump reissued on his first day in office in 2025. And this order would allow a certain set of career civil servants to be converted to a politically appointed status. Now, we haven't heard a lot about that in the last 2 months. It's been pretty quiet. There was some fanfare when it came out. And the reason for that is because agencies have a deadline of April 20th to come up with their plans for Schedule F. So I think this is something that's going to be happening in the next month that we will be hearing a lot more about. And it's sort of phase 2, I think, of the administration's reshaping government plan. The other couple of things I just want to mention here that, again, haven't gotten as much play because they haven't come online yet, is the 10-for-1 order, which is an executive order that Trump signed that said, for every new regulation we issue, we're going to take 10 off the books. So this is a sort of amplification of the 2-for-1 policy in the first Trump administration. We haven't seen a lot of how it's going to play out, partially because we were under a regulatory freeze. I think there's a lot that's going to be different about that, partially because they've returned us to the 2003 standards for how we think about regulation. And I could talk more about that if people are interested. These reforms, I also think, have the potential to be more longstanding, partially because they're more thought out. So they're more insulated from court repeal, court overturn. The next Democratic president might undo some of them, like the 10 for 1. But I think at that point, it's already going to be pretty entrenched that we're back in the 2003 standards, for example, instead of the 2023 standards. So I think there's some things that are going to be really hard to sort of rein in the imperial presidency once these things are unleashed. You can't always put them back in the box. We're not going to go back to where we were. We're going to go to a different place. And I think that's the conversation we're probably going to be having over the next 3 years is what is the next place we land? So I'll stop there and turn it over to Molly.
Great, thanks. Molly?
Great, thank you. It's great to be with all of you. So Andy asked me to talk a little bit about the Trump administration and Congress. And where I want to start is by articulating sort of two simultaneous realities. So on one hand, the Trump administration, as both Andy and Rachel outlined, is engaged in what I can only call a dramatic incursion into congressional power. And Congress really has not yet thrown its full weight behind pushing back against that in an institutional way. On the other hand, in some areas where there really is no way around the US Congress, congressional Republicans are still confronting significant intra-party divisions that are shaping their ability to act decisively. So let's start with the first one. Again, the Trump administration has engaged in a really wide set of actions that oversteps the appropriate bounds of executive power and disregards previous congressional actions. I think we can generally put these in three categories. Rachel and I did not coordinate on this, but I also have three categories for you. So the first category is a set of actions that overstep into Congress's spending power, as Andy mentioned, and constitute illegal impoundments. An impoundment being a decision by an executive agency not to spend all of the money that Congress has appropriated to it for a particular purpose. There's a second set of actions that disregard congressional authorizing decisions. So other choices that Congress has made in sort of the predicate to the spending process. Here we have seen this especially around efforts to dismantle particular federal agencies. So the U.S. Agency for International Development, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, a number of smaller independent agencies. As of today, here in the United States, the U.S. Department of Education, so on and so forth. And then there's a third set of actions here that overstep Congress's choices about appointments and the appointment power. So the administration is aggressively trying to undermine congressional design choices about making certain agency heads subject to removal only for cause rather than at the president's discretion. So one sort of flashpoint in this area this week was the president claiming he could fire two democratically appointed members of the Federal Trade Commission, which sort of regulates antitrust competition, that sort of thing here in the United States. And so, and we could expect this to escalate to something like him trying to fire the head of the Federal Reserve Bank. So I'm going to focus mainly on the spending piece of this, but I'll touch on the other ones as well. I want to say that these actions vary in the degree to which they are unconstitutional versus unlawful under different statutes versus technically legal, but institutionally damaging for Congress to the extent that we would hope that Congress would push back in an institutional way. I think this matters both for the legal strategy challenging them. So Rachel mentioned that one of the things that we're seeing is lots and lots and lots of court cases, but that also our government is not really designed to run by lawsuit. It is not designed to have kind of individual actions being executed by the executive branch, policed by the courts on a case-by-case basis. And so, but I'll also say that sort of this spectrum of how we can categorize these actions also serves as a reminder that one of the most important things going on here involves who is willing to use power and in what ways. So it's not just about sort of what the Constitution says. and what statutes say, but it's also, is Congress willing to use its political power to push back against the executive's political power? So talk about the spending power issue first. So we've seen the administration. I actually think the picture on Andy's spending slide was of a memo from the Office of Management and Budget that essentially the week after Trump's inauguration turned off many functions of the U.S. federal government in the form of a large number of federal grants and other flows of federal funding. A number of federal courts in the United States have ordered that funding turned back on, but there are big questions about the degree to which executive agencies are actually complying with those court orders, particularly in a series of grants administered by the Federal Emergency Management Agency that sort of coalesced in one of the court cases as the place where the executive branch really pretty clearly has not resumed the flow of funds. We've also seen kind of this argument in a case related to the dismantling of the U.S. Agency for International Development and its failure as a result to pay contractors for work already completed in the U.S. around the globe. So why hasn't Congress pushed back? So I want to start on the Republican side of the aisle. And there it's some combination of members of Congress agreeing with Trump, sharing these preferences, if not over the means, certainly over the ends. They like the policy outcomes that are being achieved this way. In some cases, I think there is a real fear of Trump, and particularly given the entanglements with Elon Musk, who has an enormous amount of money that he can deploy in opposition to people's future reelection prospects. I will also say that I think you will hear, and I don't think wrongly, Republican members of Congress express concern for their personal safety if they speak out against President Trump. So I think some of it is that. And then I also think, and we have in the U.S. press, you can find examples of this. There's also a belief on the part of some Republican members that, again, especially in the spending context, President Trump, Elon Musk are disrupting all of these flows of federal funding. But if that comes for me, Republican member of Congress in my district, I can use my political connections to the White House in various agencies to get the funding that affects me and my constituents turned back on. I can save this federal installation in my district from being closed, what have you. And so sort of ameliorating the effects on things that Republican members actually care about. On the Democratic side of the aisle, we've certainly seen Democratic members be very vocal in opposition to all of this. But at the same time, we saw, for example, Democrats go along in the form of giving their votes in the Senate to preventing a shutdown of some federal operations about a week ago. And many folks pointed to this as a possible place of Democratic leverage, where, if they had said, no, we're not going to vote for this unless you stop what Elon Musk is doing or any number of other things, we won't agree to keep the government open. So kind of how can we explain this? I'll offer a couple thoughts. One is that Democrats, in a way that I don't think Republicans do, fear the possibility of a government shutdown. Democrats just ideologically care more about a functioning federal government than Republicans do. And so they're just much more skittish generally about the idea of leveraging the prospect of a government shutdown in pursuit of their policy ends. I'll also say it's not entirely clear what Democrats could have gotten in these negotiations, in part because the central problem is that you have an executive branch that has demonstrated a willingness to ignore the law as it already stands. So sort of what could you write into the law that they would listen to, given that, and change their behavior based on, given what we've already seen. And related to that, it's also not clear what kind of deal you would have reached if you were the Democrats to reopen the government after a government shutdown. I'll also say that Democrats find themselves in sort of a politically challenging moment as well, and on some territory that is quite familiar to Republicans in Congress, but is much less familiar to Democrats. And here I want to say particularly that for the last 10, 15 years, Republicans in Congress have had to confront the existence of a kind of bloc within the Republican Party that prioritizes and rewards kind of fighting for the sake of fighting. So the idea that like putting up a good fight for what we want, for what we care about ideologically, that's an end in and of itself. Democrats, on the other hand, have not really had to deal with this phenomenon, and now are finding themselves with kind of a bloc within the Democratic coalition who believes that Donald Trump represents an existential threat to the United States democracy to such a degree that sort of fighting and putting up a fight, even if you don't get anything for it, is an end in and of itself. And I think they're still trying to figure out kind of how to deal with this new dynamic for them. Briefly before I wrap, I also want to talk about the second reality, which is the idea that there are some things that are going to require congressional action if they are going to happen. And there, the story of Trump's power is a little bit more complicated. So we can, if folks want to, in the Q&A, go quite deep in the procedural weeds. That is indeed where I spend much of my work life. I'm not going to do that now, but I am just going to say that the congressional Republicans have available to them an option for legislating in a limited way, pretty substantial, but not unlimited, without the possibility of a filibuster, so without the need to overcome a supermajority requirement for ending debate in the US Senate. But the nature of the limits to this process mean that Republicans have to make some hard choices about how to structure their priorities within this particular legislative toolbox. And one of those choices is around whether they should do one of these bills that has kind of special protected status or two of them. Trump, for example, came out along with House Republicans very early on in the year, very vocally for the one bill strategy. He has been calling this one big, beautiful bill. We do not have one big, beautiful bill. We do not have agreement between the House and the Senate on whether we should have one big, beautiful bill, despite the fact that, again, like Trump has indicated that this is his preference. But the realities of both some policy disagreements within the Republican Party in Congress and also just the very narrow size of the Republican majority in the House, the idea that they really can't lose that many votes for anything that they need to, they really need Congress to act on, has meant that despite lots of hopes and wishes for moving really quickly legislatively, they have not yet racked up any of these sort of major legislative wins. So I'll stop there and I'll turn it back over to you all in the room for the panel part of our discussion.
Okay, thanks so much, Molly. I want to give as much time as we can to everyone in the audience, but I'll just kick it off with one question and then I'll open it up. And I'll ask Andy since you're here. Does all of this snap back after Trump leaves? Is essentially Donald Trump such an aberration that the Imperial Presidency isn't a threat to American politics long term, or do you think that sort of this is setting a precedent that's going to significantly shape the future of the presidency even going forward?
Yeah, well, that, of course, is a very long question to answer in some ways, obvious and a very good question. I think in the end there will be some structural changes. Rachel hinted at some with regards to the nature of the administrative branch of government. I think a lot obviously will depend on how the Supreme Court comes down on some of these court cases. But again, the very scattershot nature of the lots and lots of court cases, I think we can assume that some will probably go the president's way, and you will see some shifts maybe in the long-term authority over particular positions in government or agencies. Again, sort of blessed by a Supreme Court that, let's face it, is much more sympathetic to this notion of a unitary executive than its predecessors were. Some of the claims being made about foreign policy autonomy or the war powers, again, these things may stick, and presidents use what their predecessors do, right? Joe Biden didn't come into office and say, well, everything Obama and Bush did, I'm not going to use that. He used exactly that and continued aspects of, these powers which were claimed as a result of the 9/11 attacks in arenas that had nothing to do with that. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we will see, because of the extreme nature of these claims, even if just some of it sticks, I think we're going to see shifts in the presidency. Some will depend on how, obviously, the 2026 and 2028 elections go. But I think underlying that is sort of just the nature of partisanship and the polarization that afflicts the United States, not just the United States, of course, but in terms of, the 1970s, when I talk about that resurgence, that in many ways was bipartisan, where you had, a much more diverse party base in both parties, that was willing to step back and fight against executive authority, even in a president of their own party. And at this moment, you don't see that. Now, that could change, of course, but a lot of that will depend on, public opinion really caring about executive overreach. And while there is some interesting scholarship we can talk about public opinion checking, unilateralism by the president, I don't think we're there right now.
Especially with the president that doesn't face re-election, certainly.
Right.
Okay, why don't we get some questions from the audience here? I have a number of my American government students who I know are eagerly waiting to ask a question, but why don't we start right up here, sir?
Just coming in on something you just said, or that was just said about two-term presidency. What actually has to happen if Trump was so inclined to allow for a third term?
I saw Steve Bannon talking about this just the other day.
I mean,
he's not writing it off as
the actual answer is that the Constitution would have to be amended. That's not what Steve Bannon is saying, I don't think. Do you guys want to talk about that? I mean, there have been things talked about with, if you read the 22nd Amendment closely enough, then you can figure out a way for the Trump to be the vice president, and then the president can resign and Trump can be president again. I don't quite buy it. I mean, it's pretty clear constitutionally. Then again, I thought the 14th Amendment was relatively clear about not allowing someone who had, violated their oath of office to be president again, and the court punted on that. If I may engage in one sort of scare story, I raised that case because, in fact, the Supreme Court, to avoid having to rule on whether President Trump was, in fact, an insurrectionist under the text of the 14th Amendment, post-Civil War amendment, they made it impossible, at least on the face of it, for states to enforce ballot access for anybody running for president, whether they're running for a third term or they're 22 years old or they're not an actual not an actual born citizen. The logic should apply to the states not being able to enforce any of those limits on who runs. Now, again, you would still be ineligible under the 22nd Amendment, and I'm not really suggesting this is a path that we could go down, but it does suggest the problems of trying to parse the text, if you're even the court, trying to avoid these political fights. And I understand why they wanted to avoid it, but they created other problems for themselves. You guys should wave wildly if you want to jump in, by the way.
Yes, Rachel.
I'll jump in and say, I think Andy was referring to the literature in political science on when does public opinion constrain the presidency? And my sort of rough, kind of really glib take on that literature is that Americans don't like when the president violates what they learned was the right thing in civics class for the president to do. So I do think this is one place where we all learn that you get 2 terms if you're the president, and that's it. And so I do think that public opinion, and maybe maybe I'm naive on this one, but I do think it might actually be a constraint, a meaningful constraint on this ability of Trump to do this, regardless of what he or Bannon are saying about it. But that's just my take.
Plus, he's going to be 80 plus years old. But yeah,
That's true. Colin.
Thank you. I'll aim my question to Rachel and then a really quick one to Molly afterwards. But so one really key feature of American federal government is that there is regulatory independence, right? And that agencies have, many of them have some level of independence, and civil servants can't be sacked for political reasons. It usually has to be for cause. And that's clearly something Trump doesn't agree with, and his head of the Office of Management Budget doesn't agree with it either, or the authors of Project 2025. So I guess going from Thomas's question of like the extent to which things kind of snap back in 2028, possibly, what is your sense years from now of like what the fate of regulatory independence looks like? And I know that's almost impossible, but not entirely impossible to answer. So I'm just, like how, to what extent does it survive? And then a really small version of that question to Molly is that, Molly, you mentioned that you see a lot of members in Congress, you foresee them asking for exemptions on funding gaps. To what extent do you see the same thing happening on Schedule F firings, right? So members of Congress going to bat for people who have lost their job in the federal government and kind of reversing some of those if it doesn't happen through the courts?
These are great but hard questions. I think so on the question of agency independence, there's a couple of ways you could think about this, like in formal independence, right? There's been the firings of agency heads that Trump is, according to past precedent, not allowed to fire, that he has fired. Those are going to be resolved by that question of how independent those agencies are. That question will be resolved by the Supreme Court. And I mean, my guess is that they might have a little bit of buyer's remorse on the immunity ruling. Maybe, Andy, you disagree with me on that, but that they might actually hold up the Humphreys executor decision, which is the one that says that you can't fire agency heads. But I know there's a lot of disagreement in the sort of groups I run in on this particular question. I think the other way you could think about it is all these other things that Trump is doing to rein in independent agencies, like subjecting independent agencies' rules, which have always been independent from executive review, to bring them in for review by the White House. That kind of thing, I think that could stand and might actually be the way it's done in the future, which would limit the independence of these agencies in practice, even if Trump or the next president isn't able to fire the agency heads. So I think we're going to see some sort of durable ways that their independence is more subtly eroded. And then the big question will just be kicked to the court to decide on the sort of leadership question.
Yeah, and on your question about sort of individual Republican members trying to avert the firing of particular federal employees, I suppose that's possible. There have been a number of things that have happened so far that have not received, again, like wide-scale pushback again from Republican members. So things like proposals to close a really large number of Social Security offices. So the idea that in the U.S. we have these access to our social safety net for both elderly individuals and individuals with disabilities. The like individual offices around the country that help people apply for those benefits. There's a proposal to slash dramatically the number of those offices, slash dramatically the number of people who staff the call centers. So if you have a problem and you need to call and ask a question about it, have fewer people available to answer those phones, while simultaneously requiring people who are newly applying for benefits, in many cases, to actually visit an in-person office, but you also announced you're going to cut these offices. So this is just sort of one example of something that, to me, is pretty obviously going to have a fast and significant effect on the way individual Americans experience the federal government. And again, we have not, at least generally, yet seen big pushback on this. And so perhaps that there will be, and we may not even need to make it to the Schedule F part before Rachel said the Schedule F plans are due sometime in April. Agencies have already had to file plans for how they intend to effectuate reductions in force, and that's separate from agencies that are just sort of being dismantled, or large parts of agencies that are being dismantled. So we're going to see more disruptions to all of this even sooner than the end of April, I suspect. And so again, maybe we'll see individual members kind of in a particularistic way try to get involved. But I'm not, I just don't know.
Other questions? Yeah, right up here in the front.
I was just wondering about the sort of ability of states to reconstruct or sort of create the structures of federal government that are being dismantled, and sort of the powers that the federal government has or Trump has to sort of ideologically constrain states from doing things that, you know, are that will go against what he wants to do and with the federal government.
Yeah, so federalism, of course, is another check, right? Double security on the rights of the people, Madison said at the beginning of the Republic. So the idea is, can states protect themselves, right, and have sort of a parallel government running? Part of the problem here is that while the federal government does have limited direct authority over the states, it has a lot of money that goes to the states. And so one key question, and we're seeing this playing out already, is whether the federal government can use that money in ways that will influence behavior by state-level politicians. Now, obviously, there are many governors in the red states who are very enthusiastic about what's happening, though I suspect much less so once they see Social Security offices being shut down in their districts. But the federal government basically has the power of bribery or blackmail over states, and Trump is already showing a willingness to use that. Right. One small example, again, I mentioned in Maine, our governor actually went to the National Governors Association meetings in Washington. The president basically said, hey, as the governor of Maine here, you have to change the way you do sports because Maine allows trans athletes to compete in high school sports. If you don't, we're going to take away all your federal money. And the governor said, yeah, we'll see you in court. And so I think that's actually the right response. Maine state law is not overridden by the president's interpretation of civil rights law. But the one immediate response was that if you get a Social Security number at birth, that's often done, in fact, uniformly done in hospitals. You don't have to go to an office to get a Social Security number for your new baby. About 2 days later, it was announced that Maine newborns, you'd have to actually go to an office and get this card. Now, hooking back up to what Molly said, is the senator from Maine, Susan Collins, who's the chair of the Appropriations Committee, who has been pretty squishy on opposing things about impoundment, which goes directly to the heart of her authority in Congress. She has been very active in going to the president and to Elon Musk and saying, you have to restore this cut. And so, the political benefit for her is actually pretty large, I think. Headline day one, Musk cuts whatever. Headline day three, Collins regains funding for whatever it was, right? So she's the hero here, but in a way that is undermining her systematic power and her structural power as chairman of appropriations. It's interesting, there was a book called Keystone of the Washington Establishment by a guy named Mo Fiorina, who was a professor at Stanford a number of years ago. And he had the very cynical argument that members of Congress wanted a failing bureaucracy because that allowed them to go fix things for their constituents individually. So if you had a bureaucracy that didn't work, you'd call your member of Congress, they would fix it, you would vote for them. Well, this is kind of what we have now, but only for Republicans. And to see that sort of handover of power is intriguing, to say the least.
I'll add one other sort of dimension of this question about states, which is actually to come back to the one of my two realities, which is the reality that involves things that are on the table that require congressional action. So one of the things that's going to be really interesting to watch over the next several months is the fact that there is a sizable contingent of the Congressional Republican Conference who's interested in trying to legislate pretty significant cuts to the social safety net in the United States, particularly to Medicaid, which is our government-run health insurance for low-income adults, and various forms of nutrition assistance, so programs that provide access to stable food sources to low-income individuals. And particularly in the case of Medicaid, the structure of the Medicaid program means that it's a shared responsibility financially between the federal government and the states. And in many states, most states probably, Medicaid is makes up the biggest or one of the biggest chunks of their state budgets. And so I expect that, again, in the part of the world where, like, if something is going to happen, Congress is going to have to do something. I think it's going to be really interesting to watch the way that governors get involved in that debate and the degree to which there are states, including states led by Republican governors with Republican senators, who may find themselves in really precarious fiscal positions if Republicans in Congress are able to do some of the most dramatic things that they put on the table.
Great. So we had another question over here.
Thank you. So you talked about how it's been 2 months and there's already been permanent changes that will take effect kind of in the future. Being realistic, I'd be interested to know what you think kind of the best case and worst case scenario outcomes would be from a Trump presidency. I know that's like a very long-winded question, but just kind of an overview what you think.
Anyone want to take that?
Come on, Rach.
Okay, I'll try. I mean, I think the worst case scenario is we find ourselves in a true constitutional crisis, right? Where we already have court decisions that are not being implemented or followed by the executive branch. That is a huge problem. The problems that Molly talked about with Congress, if Congress goes through this whole administration and doesn't stand up at all, like that's a problem. Like they are supposed to be a co-equal branch to the executive. So I think those are kind of like when I think about what keeps me up at night about the risks, that's the risk. Because like what happens when we don't have a government that's governed by the Constitution is a really big question. I think in sort of if we think about the administrative state, obviously we have to have a question and a conversation in the US about what do we want out of government. And I worry that we're never going to have that conversation. That these problems that are surfacing, that Republicans are very frustrated with government, like run-of-the-mill, like everyday Republicans. And our government hasn't been responsive in a lot of ways. And the Democrats have not done a good job at introducing the world to like what is the good value of government. And so I think these are like the big issues. And then the smaller issues I think are the things that we can say, well, that might be different, but it doesn't really fundamentally affect how Americans live their lives. And that's a lot of these things I think might fall under that. But you know, I don't think I can't predict. I'll leave it to Molly and Andy to predict which ones are the big ones.
I also don't have a crystal ball. I mean, I think I share Rachel's articulated concerns about worst case scenarios. I mean, I have my own that I would add to the list, not the least of which is something happens and we don't raise the statutory limit on the US debt when that comes through at some point this summer, and which would have really disastrous effects not only on the US economy, but on the world's economy. So again, plenty of things to keep us up at night. In my sort of wildest dreams, I would love to see us come out of this with both, to Rachel's last point, the ability to articulate an affirmative case for kind of why government is good and what government can do for people, and not simply accept the premise that government should be smaller. I mean, I think that like one of the things that one of the natural responses to what Elon Musk and Doge have been doing is to say, like, yes, the government does not work for people. There are things that there are ways in which people feel alienated from what the US federal government is doing, should be doing. And then the response is, so, you know, Doge is just the wrong way to reform the government. And sometimes I think that rejects the premise that, you know, like our administrative state can and does do good things. And that we sort of need to shift the way that we talk about that. And do I know if that will happen? I have no idea, but that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. So I'll just put that on the table.
Let me just add one sort of more on the bad side of the tally, I think, and that is to say that the administration has been pretty clever, really, in sort of picking victims in the early days, including paper straws. But but more seriously, right? I mean, they have sort of moved to make legal claims that in many ways can't be supported, but which are sort of sympathetic to a lot of people in the U.S. You know, bullying trans kids is actually quite a good polling number, right? And so, you know, if the worry, you know, is, well, this is how they're using federal funds, for example, to try to pressure states, they're pressuring universities and colleges as well, right? You need to change your policy or we'll take away your money, we'll prosecute you, we will, you know, sort of treat these executive orders as laws, and we will act in that way. And if people sort of concede ground, I think that then again sets a precedent, especially when then, you know, the next step is to pick a larger group, a group that has more sympathy. So they've forced people onto the political ground, perhaps, of defending things that are politically unpopular, but which principally are correct, right? Again, the governor of Maine, you know, is forced into a discussion of you know, high school sports when her preferred ground is the rule of law and the ability of the president to dictate Maine policy. But we've seen this also, and what's even more alarming perhaps this week, where we've seen, again, invocation of old statute to sort of, you know, get rid of due process when it comes to deportation. I do think, you know, I have no idea if all of the people deported to El Salvador, of all places, in the guise of them being Venezuelan gang members, are Venezuelan gang members. Some might be, but some probably aren't, and they should have their day in court to show that. So beyond the sort of invocation of that law, which speaks very specifically about A, wartime, and B, foreign governments invading, neither of which is the case, choosing a victim group that is, again, unsympathetic, and, you know, yes, those people should definitely be deported, again, allows the foot in the door. And I am a little worried about the foot in the door, to be honest, and how wide that door can be kicked open. I'm worried about that in terms of spending. I'm worried about it in terms of civil liberties.
So I just wanted to ask, we have all this negative tally of Donald Trump's maneuvers so far. If we had one of his advisors, say Stephen Miller was in this room, how would he kind of strongman the argument for how Donald Trump is exerting executive power? What would he say as a counter?
Well, he would say that I support terrorism, starting off. I mean, he would actually literally say that. I'm sympathetic to terrorists. How can you stand in the way of the president? And more importantly, of the president's voters, right? They have been very loud in invoking a supposed mandate. Now, you've looked at the electoral results. You know, it wasn't that big a mandate in a serious sense. President has taken to, you know, tweeting out the number of counties that he won. Now, there are counties in the United States that have fewer people in them than are in this room right now. But that is sort of, you know, the idea that there is sort of this democratic will that is imbued solely in the presidency. And this is something Stephen Miller literally has said. The, you know, democracy is imbued in President Trump. Now, again, I don't think you can seriously read the Constitution or the Federalist Papers or even American history and think that's true. But that is the argument. And you've seen attacks on the legitimacy of judges, you know, as being, you know, maybe they're Democrat appointees, but maybe they're just, again, sort of, you know, unwilling to let the president's work the will that was vested in him by the people. So we have sort of a tribune of the people argument on steroids here, which is, you know, I think saleable politically. Again, I don't think it's a particularly great argument constitutionally or historically, but that's been sort of one of the takes to say, the people want this, who are you, stupid professor, to get in my way?
Yeah. Rachel?
One other thing I would add is that while we have certainly seen in some of the legal cases that have been sort of coming through, coming over the transom so far, a pushback from the judicial branch against some of what the executive branch is doing. Someone recently described this to me as the executive branch is trying to eat both Congress and the federal judiciary. Congress is basically letting them eat them, and the federal judiciary is putting up a fight. But that any number of arguments that Donald Trump and his advisors are making about what they are doing are outgrowths of a very expansive view of executive power that the federal courts have increasingly endorsed over the last decade, 2 decades. So this gets back to what Rachel was talking about earlier about the unitary executive theory and the idea that actually the president does have a remarkable amount of power in the American system. And so While again, many of the individual things that are happening may eventually be rejected by federal courts, by the Supreme Court, if it makes it that far. The sort of grounds on which the executive branch is arguing that many of these things are illegal really does flow from a long sort of train of legal thought that Republicans have produced and then installed judges who support over the last several decades.
Other questions? Yeah. So the question is basically how Democrats can respond to the Trump administration and what levers are at their disposal.
Molly, you might want to talk about, get into your legislative procedure weeds at least a little bit here, because how could the Democrats in Congress actually react here?
Yeah, I mean, so there are some tools that, particularly in the Senate, that Senate Democrats have available to them. A sort of constant tension in the exercise of procedural power on the part of the minority party, particularly in the Senate, is the danger that if sort of the minority party is too obstructionist on something that the majority party absolutely really positively wants to get done, the majority party does have like has ways to go around them and change the rules in a way that would allow them to do the things they want to do in the first place. I think this sort of sense is largely constrained some of the worst impulses procedurally that sort of both parties might have pushed for. I mean, I think one of the big challenges, at least in this moment, is that while for folks who pay a lot of attention to what's happening in politics, the size and scope and scale of what's happening is quite clear, that for many Americans, that's not yet true. Although, again, I think that sometimes we undersell this. There are most federal employees actually don't live in the Washington area. I live in Washington, D.C., but most federal employees are not in the D.C. area. And so the idea that, massive cuts to the federal bureaucracy, that's not going to hit lots of other local economies, it absolutely is. And so it's actually not just sort of a Washington, D.C. problem. And not to sort of overly focus on this point about the Social Security Administration, but one of the things that's sort of puzzling to me about that as a one of the first places that the Trump administration has targeted really aggressively, as well as the Internal Revenue Service, which processes Americans' tax returns, is that if they disrupt the process for accessing benefits for elderly individuals and also people's ability to get their tax refunds in a timely manner, like those are two things that lots and lots of people are going to notice very, very quickly, whether they sort of correctly assign blame to President Trump and Elon Musk. That, I think, is where we get into this messaging question and like how do Democrats correctly describe to the American people that this is why this is happening. And then I'll just say one last thing, and then Rachel or Andy can come in. So one of the things that we saw in the first Trump administration is that some of the times when President Trump was particularly unpopular were actually not times when he was doing kind of some of the most outlandish things that he did in the first Trump administration. It was when congressional Republicans were trying to do things that were really unpopular with the American people, like repeal President Obama's signature healthcare law in the summer of 2017 and pass a large set of tax cuts for wealthy individuals later in 2017. Those things were unpopular with Americans, but they were things that Congress was trying to do, but people didn't necessarily distinguish between the idea that like, oh, this is Congress and it's not President Trump. So I think that's also just sort of important to keep an eye on as we think about what might happen in the next several months.
I'll just add that I think one of the biggest failures of Democrats here is there's no message. Like if there's a message, I've missed it and I've been trying to look for it. Who's in charge? Is it Chuck Schumer? Like, is it Hakeem Jeffries? I don't know. So I think there's so much more that they're not controlling the narrative at all. The narrative around USAID, if you're a Democrat, should not be fired workers carrying their boxes out of the headquarters. It should be the fact that we give foreign aid to countries as very strategic of us, like to keep them out of the China's sphere of influence and keep them in ours, right? That is something that is protecting national security. There's lots of other communicable diseases that were not spreading by giving foreign aid, and none of that messaging came out with USAID. The overwhelming media narrative was about employees losing their jobs, which is terrible, but that does happen in the private sector. And I think people think, well, I know someone who got fired from their job. Like, people get fired. That's, if you're not doing a good job, you should get fired. And so that narrative didn't carry well with people, and there was no democratic response beyond letting the media just report it that way. And so when I think about what should Democrats be doing, they should be acting collectively to come up with a narrative about why voters need to care about these issues.
Okay, I think we have time for about one more question, so we'll go up here.
I'd like to move into a bit of a hypothetical. So imagining that Trump's executive consolidation is fully successful and he pretty much gets what he wants, in a situation in which the Democrats come back into government, that they get majority there, do you think that it would be in their interest to try to reverse what Trump has done in consolidating the executive? Or do you think that it would be in their interest to take the opportunity and pass some things that they have been wanting to pass now that the executive branch is more powerful?
Who wants to take that?
Well, I actually think it's likely, right, that future presidents will use some of the tools that they've been handed down. It was interesting to me, actually, some of the things that President Trump did in his first term with regards to regulation. It gets kind of into the detailed weeds, but President Biden actually did reverse those, which I thought he might not, because I thought, a lot of regulatory review has existed for a long time, and presidents of both parties have wanted to have centralized review in the White House of regulations that everyone in the executive branch is issuing. Again, as Rachel mentioned, President Trump has now expanded that more explicitly to independent agencies as well. That's something that could stick. Presidents might like that. If, again, your hypothetical depends on sort of how far it goes, right? If you get rid of the entire civil service, right? Everybody is an at-will appointee. Everybody is now a patronage employee of the federal government again. I don't really think we're going to go all that way, but again, that's the logical extension of the unitary executive theory. So, if we went that far, I don't think that Democrats would like that system. They actually prefer to have, longer term expertise in governance. But yeah, I do think there are some things that will stick, and that, more tools within the executive branch will be helpful to Democratic presidents as well, especially if we're in a continuing era where Congress proves to be kind of feckless too much of the time. So I don't know if you want to.
Okay. That seems like a good note to end on. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have. Before we thank our speakers, let me remind you our next Policy and Practice event on Thursday, March 27th is coming up. That's on development and China's changing economy. So you can sign up for it via our website and Eventbrite. If you don't already, please follow us on Twitter, or X, I guess now, or Instagram. The department's handle is @UCLSPP, and the Center on U.S. Politics is @CUSP_UCL. I really don't think that we could have had better guests to guide us through this very complicated subject. So Andy, Rachel, Molly, thank you very much. Thanks to our audience for joining us, and hope to see you back very, very shortly.
Thank you all.